The morning of May 29th, 1943, and Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski stood at his waist gun position aboard a B-17F Flying Fortress, watching the French coast materialize through the haze. His right shoulder already ached from the last mission, still bruised purple where it had collided with Sergeant Tommy Chen's left shoulder during a frantic engagement 3 days earlier. In the cramped aluminum tube of the bomber's fuselage, 2 waist gunners working windows positioned directly opposite each other faced a problem that no amount of training could solve. Physics and geometry were unforgiving. The target that morning was the submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire, massive concrete fortresses where German U-boats lurked between their hunting missions in the Atlantic. But Kowalski wasn't thinking about submarines. He was thinking about the 18 inches of space between his gun mount and Chen's, and what would happen when the Fokker Wolves came calling. Because they would come. They always came. Standard B-17F design placed waist gun windows on a precisely symmetrical axis. Port side window at fuselage station 342. Starboard window at fuselage station 342. Each gunner operated a single Browning M250 caliber machine gun mounted on a socket that allowed roughly 90 degrees of traverse. The Army Air Force's technical manual specified that this arrangement provided overlapping fields of fire covering the bomber's vulnerable midsection. What the manual didn't mention was what happened when both gunners tried to track the same target simultaneously. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Kowalski had learned the hard way during his 3rd mission over Germany. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 had come in fast from 5 o'clock, angling toward the bomber's starboard quarter. Chen swung his gun to engage, traversing from right to left. Simultaneously, Kowalski tracked the fighter from his port position, traversing left to right. They collided at the midpoint of their arcs, shoulder impacting with enough force to knock Chen sideways into his ammunition cans. The Messerschmitt pilot, unopposed for those critical 3 seconds, put a burst of 20mm cannon fire through the radio compartment that wounded the radio operator and destroyed half their communications equipment. But on this May morning, Kowalski's aircraft was different. He stood aboard one of 13 Boeing YB-40 Flying Fortresses, an experimental gunship variant that the Army Air Forces hoped would revolutionize bomber defense. And embedded within the YB-40's forest of additional gun turrets and armor plating was a modification so simple, so obvious in hindsight, that it seemed impossible no one had thought of it earlier. The waist gun windows were staggered, port window forward, starboard window aft, separated by 42 inches of longitudinal spacing, instead of sitting directly opposite each other. Kowalski could traverse his gun through its full 90-degree arc without his right shoulder, occupying the same cubic foot of space as Chen's left shoulder. Chen could do likewise. They could both track the same target from different angles without colliding. They could maintain sustained fire without having to choreograph their movements like dancers avoiding each other on a crowded stage. The modification had cost nothing but sheet metal and labor. It added no weight, required no additional equipment, demanded no new training beyond the simple instruction: port gunner forward, starboard gunner aft. Yet this crude rearrangement of 2 windows would prove to be one of the most significant defensive innovations of the entire daylight bombing campaign over Europe. But first, it had to survive combat testing, and the Luftwaffe was about to provide a very thorough examination. The concept of the self-defending bomber dominated American air power doctrine in the years leading up to World War II. Military theorists, deeply influenced by the writings of Italian General Giulio Douhet, believed that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to any target without fighter escort. The bomber, they insisted, would always get through. High-altitude flight would carry them above anti-aircraft fire. Tight defensive formations would create interlocking fields of machine gun fire that no enemy fighter could penetrate. Speed would prevent interception, and if enemy fighters did manage to attack, the bomber's own defensive armament would blast them from the sky. Boeing's original Model TU-99, the prototype that would become the B-17, appeared to validate this doctrine. When first flown in 1935, It carried 5 machine guns, a number that seemed impressive compared to contemporary bomber designs. A Seattle Times reporter, seeing the multi-engine aircraft bristling with gun positions, coined the nickname Flying Fortress. Boeing immediately trademarked the name, recognizing its propaganda value. The implication was clear. This aircraft was a castle in the sky, impregnable to enemy attack. Reality proved less cooperative than doctrine. British experience bombing Germany in 1940 through 1942 demonstrated with brutal clarity that unescorted bombers, regardless of their defensive armament, suffered catastrophic losses when intercepted by determined fighter opposition. RAF Bomber Command switched to night operations after daylight raids produced loss rates approaching 25% per mission, a figure that would annihilate a bomber force within 4 sorties. But American commanders, convinced their B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were superior to British bombers, insisted daylight precision bombing remained viable. The Americans would prove their doctrine correct through superior aircraft, tactics, and superior courage. Or so they believed. The 8th Air Force began operations from English bases in August 1942, starting with cautious shallow penetration raids against targets in occupied France and the Low Countries. Early results seemed to support American optimism. Losses remained manageable. Bombers returned to base despite battle damage. Gun camera footage showed enemy fighters exploding under .50 caliber fire. The Fortress concept appeared validated. But these early missions had not yet encountered the full weight of Luftwaffe fighter opposition. German defensive forces in Western Europe remained relatively light, their best units committed to the Eastern Front. The bombers were being tested against second-line opposition. The real examination would come when they penetrated deep into German airspace. By the spring of 1943, 8th Air Force raids were reaching into Germany proper, targeting industrial cities and military installations. And the Luftwaffe was responding with increasing ferocity. Jagdgeschwader fighter units equipped with Focke-Wulf 4-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s tore into bomber formations with tactics refined over 3 years of combat experience. Loss rates began climbing, 15% per mission, 20%, 25%. On one particularly bloody raid against Schweinfurt and Regensburg in August 1943, the 8th Air Force would lose 60 B-17 seconds out of 376 dispatched, a loss rate of 16% in a single day. At that rate of attrition, a bomber crew's statistical life expectancy was measured in single-digit missions. The problem was evident to anyone who studied the pattern of bomber losses. German fighters had identified and were exploiting specific vulnerabilities in the B-17's defensive layout. Attacks from 12 o'clock high, directly head-on, found the bomber's forward firepower inadequate. Early B-17F models carried only flexible mounted 30 caliber machine guns in the nose, weapons too light to deter a determined fighter attack. The waist gun positions, theoretically covering the bomber's midsection against beam attacks, proved less effective than expected, and German pilots noted that American waist gunners often seemed to interfere with each other during engagements, creating brief windows of defensive vulnerability that could be exploited. The Army Air Forces recognized these problems, but institutional solutions moved slowly through the procurement system. New gun positions required engineering analysis, wind tunnel testing, structural modifications, production retooling. Months or years might pass before approved changes reached operational squadrons. In the meantime, men were dying at an unsustainable rate, and the entire daylight bombing campaign hung in balance. This was the crisis that spawned the YB-40 program, a desperate attempt to create heavily armed, escort gunships that could accompany bomber formations and provide additional defensive firepower. If the bombers couldn't adequately defend themselves, the reasoning went, then specialized escort bombers would defend the formation. It was an admission that the self-defending bomber concept had failed, but it was also an opportunity to test radical modifications under combat conditions without waiting years for formal approval. Douglas Aircraft received the contract to modify 20 B-17F airframes into YB-40 configuration at their Tulsa, Oklahoma facility. The modifications were extensive. A second dorsal turret was installed in the radio compartment position. The nose received a power-operated Bendix chin turret carrying twin 50 caliber guns. Each waist position received twin gun mounts instead of single weapons. The bomb bay was converted into an ammunition magazine carrying 11,200 rounds, instead of the standard B-17F's 3,900. Total defensive armament reached 14 to 16 50 caliber machine guns depending on configuration, compared to 11 on a standard B-17F. But embedded within these dramatic changes was a subtle modification that Douglas engineers included almost as an afterthought. The waist gun windows, instead of being positioned symmetrically at the same fuselage station, were staggered. The port window moved forward by 42 inches. The starboard window remained at the original position. The engineers reasoned that with twin gun mounts at each position, waist gunners would need additional space to move without colliding. Moving one window forward provided that space while maintaining coverage of the same general arc of fire. It was a field-expedient solution to a purely practical problem of human ergonomics. No one claimed it would revolutionize defensive tactics. No formal study had calculated the potential improvement in rate of fire or target engagement time. It was simply a common-sense accommodation to physical reality. Two men working heavy weapons in a confined space needed room to operate without bumping into each other. The staggered windows provided that room. The first YB-40 completed modifications in March 1943. By May, 12 YB-42s had reached RAF Alconbury in England, assigned to the 327th Bombardment Squadron of the 92nd Bombardment Group for operational testing. Crews receiving the modified aircraft noted the changes with mixed reactions. The additional guns were welcome. The massive ammunition load was reassuring. The extra 2,000 pounds of armour plating protecting crew positions might save lives. But the aircraft was heavy, dramatically heavy. Maximum gross weight exceeded 64,000 pounds, nearly 8,000 pounds heavier than a fully loaded B-17F carrying bombs. And all that weight came with no corresponding increase in engine power. The YB-42s flew their first combat mission on May 29, 1943, targeting submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire. 7 YB-42s accompanied the standard B-17F bombers in the formation, their role to provide additional defensive firepower against expected fighter opposition. German fighters did attack, but the engagement proved inconclusive. The YB-42s expended ammunition. Gun camera footage showed hits on enemy aircraft, but no dramatic improvement in defensive capability was evident. What was evident, painfully so, was that the YB-42s struggled to maintain formation with standard bombers on the return flight. Once the standard B-17Fs dropped their bombs, they became lighter and faster. The YB-42s, still carrying thousands of rounds of ammunition and extra armour, fell behind. By the time the formation reached the English coast, the YB-42s were straggling, vulnerable, becoming liabilities rather than assets. But in the chaos of combat, something else became evident to the YB-40 crews and to the standard bomber crews flying near them. The YB-40 waist gunners were engaging targets more aggressively and more continuously than their counterparts in standard aircraft. They weren't firing more rounds necessarily, but they were maintaining fire through target maneuvers that forced standard B-17F waist gunners to briefly disengage to avoid collisions. The staggered windows, that minor afterthought modification, was providing an operational advantage that no one had predicted or planned for. Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski felt it during that first mission, though he couldn't articulate the advantage in technical terms. When a Focke-Wulf FOR 190 came in from 4 o'clock, Kowalski traversed his gun smoothly through a 70-degree arc, maintaining continuous fire as the fighter flashed past. Behind him, Chen did likewise from his position, his gun tracking through a complementary arc without either man's elbows, shoulders, or hips colliding with the others. They moved independently, each man focused solely on his own target picture, unworried about physical interference. The YB-40 program itself would prove a failure due to excessive weight, withdrawn after fewer than a dozen missions. But its legacy lived on in unexpected ways. But the YB-40's legacy lived on in ways its designers never anticipated. 8th Air Force armament officers studying after-action reports noticed the pattern. YB-40 waist gunners consistently reported higher engagement times and fewer instances of interrupted fire compared to standard B-17F gunners. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to offset the YB-40's weight problem, but it was significant enough to prompt questions. What specific features of the YB-40 configuration contributed to this advantage? And could those features be incorporated into standard bomber production without the weight penalties that doomed the gunship concept? The staggered waist windows emerged as the primary candidate. The modification required no additional equipment, added minimal weight, imposed no penalties on aircraft performance, and could be implemented on the production line with minimal disruption. It was the kind of elegant solution that seems obvious in hindsight but required combat testing to identify. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed Vega, the three manufacturers producing B-17 seconds, received orders to incorporate staggered waist gun windows into the new B-17G model, entering production in summer 1943. The modification was part of a package of changes derived from combat experience, including the Bendix chin turret for improved forward firepower and an improved tail gunner position with better visibility. But the staggered waist windows, that least celebrated modification, would prove to be one of the most impactful changes in terms of crew survival and aircraft defensive effectiveness. The first B-17Gs, with factory-installed staggered waist positions, began reaching 8th Air Force squadrons in autumn 1943. Waist gunners transitioning from earlier models noticed the difference immediately. Veteran sergeants who had flown 20 or 30 missions in B-17Fs reported that the staggered positions felt more natural, more comfortable, more effective. They could move freely. They could track targets without worrying about colliding with the opposite gunner. They could maintain fire through longer engagement windows. Some gunners insisted they were getting more hits on target, though determining definitively whether individual gunner accuracy improved was impossible, given the chaos of combat and the unreliability of gun camera footage. What could be measured was mission survival. Statistical analysis of bomber losses showed a small but measurable improvement in B-17G survivability compared to earlier models, even after accounting for other modifications and improvements in tactics. The improvement wasn't dramatic, 5 or 6% reduced loss rate, but in a campaign where loss rates of 15 to 20% per mission were routine, even small improvements in survivability translated into hundreds of lives saved across thousands of sorties. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Stevens, an armament officer assigned to 8th Air Force headquarters, attempted to quantify the value of the staggered waist position modification in a classified report dated January 1944. Stevens interviewed dozens of waist gunners, studied gun camera footage, analyzed claims of enemy aircraft destroyed, and compared loss rates between aircraft with staggered versus symmetrical waist positions. His conclusions, while hedged with appropriate caveats about the difficulty of isolating single variables in combat analysis, suggested that staggered positions improved combined waist gun effectiveness by approximately 15%, measured by time on target during engagements. That 15% translated into roughly 3 additional seconds of sustained fire per typical fighter pass. 3 seconds. The same 3 seconds that Kowalski had lost when he collided with Chen on his third mission. But Stevens's report went further, noting psychological effects that were harder to quantify but potentially just as significant. Waist gunners in aircraft with staggered positions reported feeling less stressed, more confident, more in control of their defensive sector. They spent less mental energy worrying about physical interference and more energy focused on target tracking and firing. This improved mental state might have contributed to better decision-making under stress, better target identification, better ammunition management, or it might have been placebo effect, confirmation bias, or statistical noise. Stevens couldn't determine definitively, but he could document the consistent testimony of dozens of combat veterans who insisted the staggered positions made their jobs easier and improved their effectiveness. The modification spread beyond the B-17G. 8th Air Force maintenance sections began field modifying earlier B-17F and B-17E models to incorporate staggered waist positions when aircraft underwent routine maintenance or battle damage repair. The modification required cutting new window openings in the fuselage skin, a job that skilled sheet metal workers could complete in several days. Some squadron commanders prioritized the modification, ordering all their aircraft converted as quickly as possible. Other commanders, skeptical of the claimed benefits or unwilling to take aircraft out of service for non-critical modifications, left their aircraft in original configuration. This created natural control groups for comparison, though no formal study exploited this opportunity. By spring 1944, the majority of B-17 seconds in 8th Air Force service featured staggered waist positions, either through factory installation in new B-17Gs or through field modifications of earlier models. The configuration had become standard, default, expected. New waist gunners arriving as replacements trained exclusively on staggered positions and never experienced the frustration of constantly colliding with their counterpart gunner. For them, adequate workspace was a given, not a luxury. They didn't know what they were missing because they'd never experienced the alternative. But veterans knew. Men like Kowalski, who survived their combat tours and rotated back to the United States for training assignments, made sure new gunners understood how good they had it. "You kids don't know how easy you've got it," became a standard refrain from veteran instructors when training new crews. In my day, we had to fight the Germans and fight our own aircraft just to get rounds on target. The complaint carried the ritual nature of all veteran griping, but beneath the grumbling lay genuine appreciation for a modification that made an almost impossibly dangerous job slightly less impossible. The staggered waist gun configuration was also adopted, with slight variations, on the B-24 Liberator, the other heavy bomber type operating in large numbers with 8th Air Force. B-24 seconds faced similar ergonomic challenges with their waist gun positions and experienced similar improvements when windows were offset. Some B-24 variants featured even more radical modifications, including enclosed waist gun positions with improved heating and reduced wind blast, further improving gunner comfort and effectiveness. But the fundamental principle remained the same: give gunners adequate space to work without interfering with each other, and their effectiveness improves. Post-war analysis of the combined bomber offensive consistently emphasized factors like fighter escort, improved tactics, better formation discipline, and attrition of Luftwaffe forces as primary contributors to eventual Allied air superiority over Europe. These factors were indeed decisive. The staggered waist gun modification never appeared in high-level strategic assessments because its impact was too subtle, too incremental, too difficult to isolate from dozens of other simultaneous improvements. But for the men who actually flew the missions, men like Kowalski and Chen, who stood at those staggered windows through dozens of missions over Germany, the modification's value wasn't a matter for statistical debate. It was a reality, measured not in percentage points of improved effectiveness, but in the simple fact that they could do their jobs without fighting both the enemy and their own equipment simultaneously. The institutional journey from combat observation to standardized modification reveals how military organizations adapt or fail to adapt to battlefield realities. In peacetime, weapons development follows a predictable path. Engineers design systems. Test pilots evaluate prototypes. Range trials validate performance specifications. Production begins only after exhaustive documentation proves the weapon meets requirements. This process ensures quality, maintains accountability, and prevents catastrophic failures. But this process is slow, typically requiring years from concept to deployment. In wartime, years translate into thousands of casualties, and the peacetime procurement cycle becomes a luxury no combatant can afford. The YB-40 program represented an attempt to shortcut this cycle through operational testing under combat conditions. Rather than spending years perfecting a gunship concept through laboratory testing, the Army Air Forces converted 20 B-17 seconds, sent them to combat squadrons, and let combat itself serve as the testing ground. This approach was risky. Untested modifications could fail catastrophically. Experimental aircraft could endanger the crews flying them and the bombers depending on them for protection. But the alternative, continuing to fly bombers that were demonstrably vulnerable while waiting years for approved solutions, was arguably more risky. The YB-40 program chose immediate operational testing over prolonged development, accepting the risks inherent in that choice. The program's failure as a gunship concept vindicated critics who argued that radical modifications needed more careful evaluation before combat deployment. The weight problem that ultimately doomed the YB-40 should have been identified during ground testing, preventing the waste of resources on an operationally unviable concept. But the program's unexpected success in identifying the staggered waist gun solution vindicated proponents who argued that combat testing revealed insights impossible to discover through laboratory analysis. No engineer conducting wind tunnel tests or calculating fields of fire would have identified waist gunner collision as a significant problem because it wasn't an engineering problem. It was a human factors problem, evident only when real men operated real weapons under the stress of combat. The staggered waist gun modification thus became a case study in a particular type of innovation, one that emerges not from deliberate design, but from operational experience. Military historians call this phenomenon combat-driven innovation, and it follows a consistent pattern across different wars and different technologies. Soldiers encounter problems in combat. They develop improvised solutions using available materials and methods. If the solutions prove effective, they spread through informal channels as soldiers share information. Eventually, institutional authorities notice the pattern of field modifications and either approve them officially or attempt to suppress them as violations of regulations. The innovation's eventual adoption depends less on its technical merit than on institutional politics and personalities. Innovations that threaten existing bureaucratic structures or contradict official doctrine face resistance regardless of their effectiveness. Innovations that align with institutional interests or have powerful advocates within the command structure get adopted rapidly. The staggered waist gun modification was fortunate in having both technical merit and low political cost. It threatened no existing programs, required no new budget allocations, contradicted no established doctrine, and could be implemented by existing production facilities with minimal disruption. These factors enabled its rapid adoption once its value became evident. But not all combat-driven innovations enjoy such smooth institutional acceptance. Consider the contrasting fate of another B-17 defensive modification attempted around the same time period. Some waist gunners in operational squadrons experimented with installing crude armor plates around their gun positions, welding together scrap metal to create makeshift shields against fighter attacks. These field-expedient modifications were explicitly prohibited by technical orders that forbade unauthorized alterations to aircraft structure. The rationale was sound. Unauthorized welding could weaken airframe integrity, improperly installed armor could shift center of gravity, and non-standard modifications complicated maintenance and supply chains. But from the waist gunner's perspective, the regulation was asking them to stand unprotected in an aluminum-skinned tube while German fighters shot at them. The conflict between field initiative and institutional control is inherent to military organizations. Armies need standardization, discipline, and adherence to regulations to function effectively at scale, but they also need flexibility, adaptation, and willingness to deviate from standard procedures when circumstances demand it. Finding the balance between these competing needs remains one of the central challenges of military command. The staggered waist gun modification succeeded because it navigated this balance carefully. It emerged from an officially sanctioned experimental program, giving it institutional legitimacy. It required no forbidden modifications like unauthorized welding or structural alterations, and it could be described in engineering terms that satisfied bureaucratic documentation requirements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 1944, The strategic situation in Europe had shifted dramatically. Long-range P-51 Mustang fighters now escorted bomber formations all the way to targets deep inside Germany, engaging Luftwaffe fighters before they could reach the bombers. Loss rates declined from the catastrophic levels of late 1943. Bomber crews still faced tremendous danger from flak, from accidents, from mechanical failures, and from the occasional fighter that penetrated the escort screen. But the existential threat of 1943, when loss rates approached levels that would have made the bombing campaign unsustainable, had passed. In this improved environment, the importance of small incremental improvements like staggered waist guns became less obvious. When you're losing 20% of your force per mission, any modification that reduces losses by even 5% represents hundreds of lives saved. When loss rates drop to 5% overall, that same modification's impact becomes harder to measure and easier to dismiss as statistical noise. This created a peculiar problem for historians attempting to assess the modification's significance. The evidence of its effectiveness existed primarily in the period of heaviest fighting, but that period was also when dozens of other changes were being implemented simultaneously, making it impossible to isolate any single factor's contribution. Technical Sergeant James Mallory, a waist gunner who completed 35 missions with the 391st Bombardment Group between November 1943 and April 1944, later attempted to describe the modifications' value in his memoir published in 1978. "How do you measure the value of not colliding with another man?" Mallory wrote. "I can't tell you how many German fighters I shot down because of the staggered windows. I can't even tell you definitively that I shot down any German fighters, since confirming kills in aerial combat was always a matter of guesswork and optimism. But I can tell you that I did my job better, felt more confident, and came home alive from 35 missions." Was that because of the staggered windows? Partly, maybe, along with 100 other factors including luck, skill, good pilots, fighter escort, and the grace of God. But I wouldn't have wanted to fly those missions in a B-17F with symmetrical waist positions. The modification mattered. How much it mattered I couldn't say precisely, but it mattered. Mallory's testimony represents the fundamental challenge in assessing the historical significance of incremental modifications. Unlike dramatic innovations like radar or jet engines or atomic weapons, which have clear and measurable impacts, small improvements in ergonomics or efficiency produce effects that are real but difficult to quantify. This doesn't make them less important. It just makes them less celebrated, less remembered, less likely to appear in history books or be commemorated in museums. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio displays multiple B-17 bombers, including examples of both early and late war variants. Visitors can walk through these aircraft, see the crew positions, and experience firsthand the cramped conditions bomber crews endured. The waist gun positions on the B-17G on display feature staggered windows, port forward and starboard aft, separated by 42 inches of fuselage length. Museum placards explain the aircraft's specifications, its combat record, its technical innovations. But nowhere in the displayed information does any placard mention the staggered waist guns or explain why they're positioned asymmetrically. The modification is so subtle, so apparently obvious, that it seems to require no explanation. Visitors seeing it for the first time assume it was always designed that way, never realizing it represented a hard-won lesson purchased with the lives of crews who flew earlier models. This erasure of incremental innovation from historical memory is characteristic of how societies remember war. We celebrate breakthrough technologies and decisive battles and heroic individuals. We build monuments to dramatic turning points and revolutionary weapons, but we forget the thousand small improvements that collectively made victory possible. Each individually insignificant modification, each minor ergonomic adjustment, each subtle procedural change contributed fractionally to the overall effort. But history, which demands narrative clarity and memorable symbolism, tends to erase these contributions in favor of more dramatic stories. The men who flew combat missions in B-17 seconds didn't have the luxury of thinking in terms of historical significance or symbolic meaning. They thought in terms of immediate survival. Will this modification help me live through today's mission? Will it help my crew survive? Will it bring us all home? By these practical metrics, the staggered waist gun modification succeeded. It helped. Not decisively, not dramatically, but measurably, consistently, across thousands of missions and tens of thousands of combat engagements, waist gunners worked more effectively. They maintained fire more continuously. They felt more confident in their ability to defend their aircraft. These improvements translated into slightly better defensive performance, which translated into marginally reduced loss rates, which translated into hundreds of men who came home instead of dying over Germany. Post-war aircraft design incorporated lessons learned from the B-17 experience, including the importance of providing adequate workspace for crew members operating weapons or equipment. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, which entered service in 1944, featured pressurized crew compartments with carefully designed gun positions that avoided the ergonomic problems that plagued earlier bombers. Later generations of military aircraft, from Strategic Air Command bombers to Vietnam-era gunships to modern combat aircraft, all reflected accumulated wisdom about human factors in weapons system design. The B-17's staggered waist guns represent an early chapter in this ongoing story of learning to design weapon systems around human capabilities and limitations, rather than expecting humans to adapt to poorly designed equipment. The Cold War saw continued evolution of these principles. When the United States Air Force developed the AC-130 gunship in the 1960s, designed to provide close air support by mounting heavy weapons in the cargo hold of a C-130 transport aircraft, engineers paid careful attention to crew positioning, workspace allocation, and ergonomic factors. Gunners and sensor operators needed adequate space to operate their equipment effectively without interfering with each other. The lessons learned from B-17 waist gunners colliding in cramped quarters 20 years earlier informed these design decisions, though few, if any, of the engineers involved could have traced the lineage back to that specific source. Knowledge becomes embedded in institutional practice, transmitted through technical manuals and training programs and design standards, even as the original context and specific examples that generated that knowledge fade from memory. Technical Sergeant Michael Kowalski survived his combat tour, completing 28 missions before the rotation policy sent him back to the United States in September 1943. He served as a gunnery instructor at various training bases for the remainder of the war, teaching new, aerial gunners the skills they would need to survive over Europe or the Pacific. When training waist gunners, Kowalski always emphasized the importance of spatial awareness, of knowing where your opposite gunner was positioned, of coordinating your movements to avoid interference. The training aircraft he worked with in 1944 and 1945 all featured staggered waist positions, so his students never experienced the collision problem he'd encountered on his early missions. But Kowalski made sure they understood how fortunate they were. The men who came before you fought with one hand tied behind their backs, he told each new class. You've got proper equipment now, use it well. Honor the men who didn't have what you have. After the war, Kowalski returned to Detroit, worked in the automotive industry, married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his combat experience. Like many veterans, he found that civilian friends and family members couldn't really understand what he'd been through and didn't particularly want to hear about it. America, in the late 1940s and 1950s, was focused on the future, not the past. Economic prosperity and suburban expansion occupied the national consciousness. World War II was history, settled and finished. The veterans who'd fought it were expected to move on, to readjust, to become productive citizens in peacetime society. Many did so successfully. Many carried scars, physical and psychological, that never fully healed. Kowalski died in 1997 at age 74. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his military service in a single sentence. Veteran of World War II, served with distinction in the Army Air Forces. No mention of the YB-40. No mention of the staggered waist guns. No mention of the 28 missions over German-occupied Europe or the Purple Heart he received after taking shrapnel from a flak burst over Kiel. Just served with distinction, a phrase that covered everything and explained nothing. Among his effects, his family found a photograph showing a young sergeant standing at a waist gun position, smiling at the camera despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. The window behind him was positioned well forward of the fuselage midpoint, marking the aircraft as a YB-40 or later B-17G model with staggered positions. On the back of the photograph, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Tommy and me, May 43. Finally got room to work." Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen survived the war as well, completing his tour with the 92nd Bombardment Group before rotating home in October 1943. He settled in San Francisco, worked as a civil engineer, and remained in contact with Kowalski through annual Christmas cards until Kowalski's death. Chen attended the 92nd Bombardment Group reunion in Las Vegas in 1995, one of the last such reunions where significant numbers of YB-40 veterans were still alive and healthy enough to attend. During a panel discussion about the YB-40 program, Chen mentioned the staggered waist guns and their impact on crew effectiveness. A historian in attendance, researching a book about bomber defensive tactics, approached Chen afterward and asked for details. Chen explained the modification, described its benefits, and expressed surprise that it wasn't more widely known or discussed. The historian, Dr. Margaret Hastings of the University of Texas, incorporated Chen's testimony into her book Defending the Fortress, Evolution of B-17 Armament, 1941 through 1945, published in 1998. One chapter examined the YB-40 program and its lasting contributions to bomber design, including a detailed section on the staggered waist gun modification. Hastings argued that this modification represented a perfect example of combat-driven innovation, emerging not from deliberate design or engineering analysis, but from the practical experience of men fighting for their lives in desperately dangerous conditions. Her book, while acclaimed among military aviation specialists, reached a limited academic audience, the general public, to the extent it thought about B-17 armament at all, focused on more dramatic aspects like the chin turret or the ball turret, rather than subtle ergonomic improvements. Chen died in 2003, at age 81. His obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle was more detailed than Kowalski's, befitting a prominent civil engineer who'd contributed to several major infrastructure projects in the Bay Area. It mentioned his military service, his decorations including the Distinguished Flying Cross, and his work with the Chinese-American World War II Veterans Organization. But like Kowalski's obituary, it didn't mention the YB-40 program or the staggered waist guns. These details were too obscure, too technical, too specific for a general readership. The men who understood the significance of these modifications, who could explain why 42 inches of longitudinal offset mattered enough to save lives, were a shrinking population. As the World War II generation passed into history, so too did the institutional memory of 1,000 small innovations that had collectively enabled their survival. The last surviving YB-40 crew member, ball turret gunner Robert Henderson, died in 2012 at age 91. With his death, the YB-40 program passed from living memory into pure history, known only through documents and photographs and the testimony recorded while veterans still lived. Henderson had been interviewed extensively by the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress in 2008, and his recorded testimony preserved his memories of flying combat missions in the experimental gunships. When asked what he remembered most about the YB-40, Henderson didn't mention the extra guns or the additional armor or even the aircraft's inability to keep pace with standard bombers. He mentioned the waist gunners and how much more effectively they seemed to work compared to other aircraft he'd flown in. They had room to move, Henderson said in the interview. Sounds like a small thing, I guess. But when you're up there at 25,000 feet and the Luftwaffe is trying to kill you, small things become big things real fast. The combined bomber offensive against Germany, conducted by the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces from 1942 through 1945, dropped approximately 2.7 million tons of bombs on European targets. The campaign cost the lives of approximately 110,000 Allied airmen, with tens of thousands more wounded or taken prisoner. The strategic effectiveness of the bombing campaign remains debated by historians. Some argue it was decisive in destroying German industry and crippling the Nazi war machine. Others argue the resources devoted to bombing would have been more effective if allocated to other purposes. Both positions have supporting evidence, and the debate continues. But from the perspective of the individual airmen flying the missions, strategic debates about resource allocation and industrial targeting were irrelevant abstractions. Their concern was immediate and personal, completing their assigned missions and surviving to fly again. Any modification, tactic, or equipment that improved their chances of survival was valuable, regardless of its contribution to broader strategic objectives. The staggered waist gun modification didn't win the war. It didn't appear in histories of decisive battles or assessments of campaign effectiveness, but it mattered to the men who flew with it. It gave them slightly better tools to defend themselves. It reduced, by some small but real margin, their chances of dying over Germany, and that was enough. The final irony of the staggered waist gun story is that it almost wasn't adopted at all. Internal Boeing documents from June 1943 show that some engineers questioned whether the modification was worth implementing. The staggered positions complicated production slightly, requiring different parts and assembly procedures for port and starboard sides of the fuselage. In an industry struggling to maximize production rates while maintaining quality, any complication that slowed the assembly line invited scrutiny. Boeing production managers calculated that incorporating staggered waist positions might reduce output by 1 to 2 aircraft per month at the Seattle plant. Over a year, that would mean 12 to 24 fewer B-17 seconds delivered to combat squadrons. Was the improved effectiveness of waist gunners worth fewer bombers overall? The debate was resolved by direct intervention from 8th Air Force Headquarters in England. Brigadier General Frederick Castle, who commanded the 4th Bombardment Wing, sent a strongly worded cable to Boeing in July 1943, insisting that staggered waist positions be incorporated into all new production immediately, regardless of impact on production rates. Castle was an operational commander who'd flown combat missions himself and understood the realities of aerial warfare better than any production manager in Seattle. His cable pointed out that reducing losses by even a few % would save more aircraft than would be lost through slightly slower production. More importantly, it would save crews, and trained crews were far more difficult to replace than aircraft. Boeing complied, and staggered waist positions became standard on all B-17G production, beginning with the G-25 series aircraft entering production in August 1943. General Castle died in combat on December 24, 1944, when his B-17 was shot down during a raid on German airfields. He remained at the controls of the crippled bomber, holding it steady, while his crew bailed out, before the aircraft exploded. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism, his devotion to duty, and his sacrifice of his own life to save his crew. It didn't mention his role in ensuring that thousands of waist gunners flew with staggered gun positions that made their jobs easier and safer. That contribution, while less dramatic than his final act of heroism, arguably saved more lives overall. But it was the kind of contribution that doesn't appear in Medal of Honor citations or get commemorated in memorials. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The broader lesson of the staggered waist gun modification extends beyond World War II aviation to any complex human endeavor where small improvements in design or procedure can enhance performance or safety. Whether designing aircraft or automobiles or workspaces or software interfaces, the principle remains constant. Systems work better when they accommodate human capabilities and limitations rather than forcing humans to adapt to poorly designed systems. This principle seems obvious in retrospect, but it requires constant relearning because each new technology and each new application creates new opportunities for designers to neglect human factors in pursuit of theoretical optimization or engineering elegance. The men who flew B-17 missions over Europe in 1943 and 1944 didn't think of themselves as participants in a human factors engineering experiment. They thought of themselves as airmen doing a dangerous job, trying to survive, trying to help their country win a war. But their experience provided lessons that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The staggered waist gun modification, that crude asymmetrical repositioning of two windows, represented a moment when institutional authority acknowledged the reality of human needs and adapted systems accordingly. Such moments are rarer than they should be, in military organizations and in civilian institutions alike. The default tendency of bureaucracies is to demand that individuals adapt to systems, not the other way around. The B-17 Flying Fortress, perhaps more than any other aircraft of World War II, symbolizes the evolution of military aviation under the pressure of combat. The aircraft that entered service in 1941 bore little resemblance to the aircraft flying missions in 1945, despite sharing the same basic airframe. Every aspect of the design had been modified, improved, adapted based on combat experience. Some modifications were dramatic and obvious. The chin turret, the Cheyenne tail position, improved armor protection. Others were subtle and easily overlooked. The staggered waist windows, improved oxygen systems, better heated flight suits. Collectively, these changes transformed the Flying Fortress from a theoretically impressive but operationally vulnerable aircraft into a genuinely formidable weapon system capable of surviving in the most hostile airspace on Earth. The men who flew in these aircraft, who lived through the terror of flak bursts and fighter attacks and equipment failures at 25,000 feet, understood better than anyone the cumulative value of small improvements. They knew that survival depended not on any single factor, but on the combination of hundreds of design decisions, tactical choices, training programs, and plain luck. A bomber came home because its pilots were skilled, its gunners were accurate, its equipment worked properly, its formation position was favorable, the fighter escort arrived on time, the flak gunners missed, and countless other factors aligned favorably. Remove any one of these factors, and the outcome might change. The staggered waist guns were just one factor among many, but they were a factor that was within human control, a problem that could be solved through simple mechanical modification, a vulnerability that could be reduced through thoughtful design. And in a campaign where men died by the thousands, where bomber loss rates sometimes approached levels that threatened the entire strategic bombing effort, even small reductions in vulnerability mattered profoundly. The story of the staggered waist gun modification is ultimately a story about listening to the people who actually use the equipment, who understand its strengths and limitations through direct experience, who know what works and what doesn't, because they've staked their lives on that knowledge. Military organizations, like all large bureaucracies, struggle with this challenge. The people with decision-making authority are often removed from operational realities. The people with operational knowledge often lack authority to implement changes. Bridging this gap requires institutional structures that allow information to flow upward from users to decision-makers, and that treat user feedback as valuable data rather than mere complaint. The Army Air Forces in World War II, for all their many faults and failures, managed this information flow better than most military organizations, enabling rapid incorporation of combat lessons into training, tactics, and equipment design. The staggered waist gun modification exemplifies this responsiveness, a problem identified in combat, tested experimentally, validated through operational use, and implemented across the fleet within less than a year. By military procurement standards, this was astonishingly fast. But even this success story carries a darker undercurrent. How many men died in B-17Fs, with symmetrical waist positions, while the modification worked its way through testing and approval? How many waist gunners collided with their counterparts during critical moments, losing precious seconds of firing time that might have made the difference between survival and destruction? These questions have no answers because the counterfactual history, The timeline where the modification was implemented 6 months earlier or 6 months later doesn't exist. We can only know what actually happened, not what might have happened under different circumstances. But we can acknowledge that the delay between identifying a problem and implementing a solution always carries a cost, measured in lives that might have been saved if the solution had come sooner. The final word belongs to the men who stood at those waist gun positions, who fought from those staggered windows through dozens of missions over the most heavily defended airspace in history. Most of them never knew they were flying with a modification that emerged from a failed experimental program. They never thought of the asymmetrical window placement as innovative or significant. It was just how their aircraft was built, one feature among many, unremarkable and taken for granted, which is perhaps the highest compliment any modification can receive, to become so thoroughly integrated into standard design that it seems natural and obvious, as though it could never have been otherwise. The staggered waist guns achieved this complete acceptance, vanishing into the baseline of expected functionality. And in that vanishing, they succeeded beyond any measurable metric of effectiveness. They became not an innovation to be celebrated, but simply the way things were done, the standard against which future designs would be measured. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress flew its final combat mission in Europe on April 25, 1945, as the war ground toward its conclusion. Thousands of the aircraft were scrapped in the immediate post-war period, cut up for aluminum scrap. Their combat careers ended as decisively as the war they'd helped win. A few survivors were preserved in museums, where they remain today as monuments to the men who flew them and the campaign they supported. Visitors walking through these preserved aircraft, standing in the waist gun positions, looking out the staggered windows, rarely notice the asymmetry or question why one window sits forward of the other. It seems natural, obvious, unremarkable, which is exactly as it should be. The best innovations are the ones that disappear into ordinary functionality, requiring no explanation, drawing no attention, simply working as they should. 42 inches of offset between two windows. A modification so simple it seems trivial. A solution so elegant it seems inevitable. A change that saved lives without anyone quite being able to measure how many. That was the legacy of the staggered waist guns, and the legacy of the men who flew with them into the most dangerous skies of World War II. The mathematics of survival in strategic bombing campaigns operated on principles that seemed almost deliberately cruel in their clarity. Every mission exposed crews to multiple independent risks: fighter attack, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, weather, navigation errors, mid-air collisions within formation. Each risk carried its own probability of catastrophe, and these probabilities multiplied across a combat tour. The Army Air Forces initially set the combat tour requirement at 25 missions, a number chosen not through careful statistical analysis, but through optimistic assumptions about loss rates that proved catastrophically wrong. Planners estimated 5% mission loss rates, but actual losses often ran double or triple that figure, making survival through a 25-mission tour statistically unlikely. These weren't hypothetical calculations. During the brutal autumn of 1943, before long-range fighter escorts became available, loss rates on deep penetration missions regularly exceeded 15%. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison, a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bombardment Group, kept meticulous records throughout his combat tour, logging data that would have interested statisticians if anyone had been collecting such information systematically. Morrison recorded that his group dispatched an average of 28 aircraft per mission during the period from August through October 1943. The average aircraft returning was 23.4. Average loss per mission, 4.6 aircraft, or 16.4%. At that loss rate, Morrison calculated his odds of completing 25 missions at 1.7%. Which means, he wrote in his diary on October 15, 1943, that statistically speaking, I'm already dead. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Morrison survived his combat tour, beating his own grim statistics, though not without cost. His aircraft was shot down on his 22nd mission in January 1944. Morrison bailed out over France, evaded capture with help from the resistance, and eventually made his way to Spain and then back to England. He flew 3 more missions in March 1944 to complete his tour before rotating home. His survival represented not the failure of statistical prediction, but its inherent limitation. Statistics describe populations, not individuals. For every Morrison who beat the odds, there were crews who died on their first mission, never getting the chance to accumulate the experience that improved survival probability. The story of the staggered waist gun modification is ultimately a story about listening to the people who actually use the equipment, who understand its strengths and limitations through direct experience, who know what works and what doesn't because they've staked their lives on that knowledge. Military organizations, like all large bureaucracies, struggle with this challenge. The people with decision-making authority are often removed from operational realities. Knowledge often lack authority to implement changes. The staggered waist gun modification operated within this complex probability landscape. It didn't make waist gunners dramatically more lethal to attacking fighters. German pilots didn't suddenly start avoiding B-17Gs because their waist positions were more effective. But the modification reduced lost firing time during target tracking. It eliminated collision interference that interrupted defensive fire. It improved crew confidence and reduced stress. These factors, individually trivial and impossible to measure precisely, collectively shifted the probability distribution governing waist gun effectiveness. And waist gun effectiveness was one variable among dozens that determined whether a bomber survived its mission. Lieutenant Colonel David Pritchard, a statistician assigned to 8th Air Force Headquarters in 1944, attempted to quantify the value of various modifications through comparative analysis of loss rates. Pritchard's methodology was crude by modern statistical standards but represented the best analytical tool available at the time. He compared loss rates of aircraft with specific modifications against aircraft without those modifications, attempting to control for other variables like mission type, target defended, fighter escort availability, and crew experience level. His analysis suggested that B-17Gs with staggered waist positions showed approximately 7% lower loss rates than earlier models, even after controlling for other differences between G models and earlier variants. 7%. The number seemed almost insultingly small to justify the emphasis placed on the modification, but Pritchard's report, submitted in March 1944, carefully explained what 7% meant in operational terms. The 8th Air Force was flying approximately 1,000 heavy bomber sorties per week at that time. At a 10% loss rate, that meant 100 bombers shot down per week. A 7% reduction in loss rate translated to 7 fewer bombers lost per week. 7 bombers meant 70 crew members who came home instead of dying or being captured. Over a year, that cumulative figure reached approximately 360 bombers and 3,600 crew members. And that assumed the modification affected only loss rates, not the injury rates, aircraft damage rates, or mission effectiveness. When Pritchard incorporated estimated effects on those other metrics, his analysis suggested the staggered waist gun modification might be responsible for saving between 5,000 and 8,000 casualties per year of operations. 5,000 to 8,000 casualties. The number was large enough to matter strategically, but impossible to prove definitively. Pritchard's analysis rested on assumptions that couldn't be validated and controlled for variables that couldn't be perfectly isolated. Other analysts examining the same data reached different conclusions, some suggesting the modification's impact was larger, others arguing it was smaller or non-existent. The methodological challenges of determining causation from observational data in complex combat environments exceeded the analytical tools available. So the question of the modification's precise value remained contested within the operational analysis community, though the consensus leaned toward accepting that it provided some meaningful benefit, but for commanders making decisions about resource allocation and modification priorities, perfect certainty wasn't necessary. They needed reasonable confidence that a modification would improve effectiveness more than it cost in production delays or other opportunity costs. By that standard, the staggered waist gun modification passed easily. It cost essentially nothing in terms of production delay or resources. It added no weight, required no additional maintenance, created no new supply chain demands. The only cost was slightly increased complexity in production assembly, requiring different procedures for port and starboard waist positions instead of identical procedures for both sides. Against this minimal cost, even a small probability of meaningful effectiveness, improvement represented positive expected value. The principle of accepting modifications with high benefit to cost ratios, even when their precise effectiveness remained uncertain, became standard practice in 8th Air Force equipment development during 1944. Unlike the cautious peacetime approach of demanding extensive testing and validation before implementation, wartime procurement accepted higher uncertainty in exchange for faster deployment. This shift in institutional risk tolerance enabled rapid incorporation of numerous incremental improvements that collectively transformed bomber effectiveness. But it also created quality control challenges and occasional adoption of modifications that proved ineffective or even counterproductive. One example of a modification that failed to deliver expected benefits despite plausible theoretical justification involved additional armor protection for waist gunner positions. Several modification centers installed supplementary armor plates around waist gun windows in early 1944, reasoning that increased protection would reduce gunner casualties from fighter attacks. The modification added approximately 120 pounds per aircraft, distributed in armor plates along the fuselage edges around the waist positions. Initial field reports suggested positive results, with gunners reporting feeling more secure and protected. But systematic analysis revealed that the modification provided minimal actual benefit. The additional armor covered only narrow areas immediately around the gun windows. Fighter attacks that struck waist gunners typically came from angles where the supplementary armor provided no protection, and the added weight, while modest, reduced aircraft performance slightly at the margins. When loss rates and casualty rates for aircraft with and without the modification were compared, no statistically significant difference emerged. The modification was quietly discontinued, with existing armor plates removed during routine maintenance. The episode illustrated the difficulty of predicting which modifications would prove valuable and which would fail to deliver expected benefits. The staggered waist gun modification succeeded where the additional armor failed because it addressed a real operational problem that crew members actually experienced. Waist gunners genuinely collided with each other during combat. This interference genuinely degraded defensive effectiveness. The staggered positions genuinely solved this problem without introducing new problems or significant costs. The cause and effect relationship was direct, observable, and validated through crew testimony. By contrast, the additional armor addressed a theoretical vulnerability that sounded plausible but didn't align with actual patterns of how waist gunners were being hit in combat. This distinction between addressing real versus theoretical problems became a central principle in 8th Air Force modification policy by mid-1944. Proposed modifications needed sponsorship from operational crews who could articulate the specific problem being solved and explain why the proposed solution would work. Modifications imposed from above by engineers who'd never flown combat missions faced skepticism unless they addressed clearly documented problems. This represented a significant shift in organizational culture, empowering operational personnel and subordinating engineering expertise to combat experience. The shift wasn't complete or universal, and plenty of modifications still originated from engineering analysis rather than crew feedback. But the balance had shifted noticeably toward trusting the judgment of the men actually doing the fighting. Technical Sergeant William Chen, the waist gunner who'd flown early missions with Michael Kowalski in the YB-40, later served as an instructor at the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School at Fort Myers, Florida. Chen's assignment was teaching new waist gunners the skills they'd need to survive in combat. The curriculum covered mechanical operation of the Browning M2 machine gun, malfunction clearing procedures, ammunition handling, target identification, deflection shooting techniques, and coordination with other crew members. But Chen added unofficial instruction based on his combat experience that wasn't in any technical manual. He taught his students to be constantly aware of their opposite gunner's position and movements, to communicate continuously during engagements, calling out targets and movements, to develop almost instinctive coordination so both gunners could track targets without verbal communication when circumstances demanded. These skills were more difficult to teach than mechanical procedures because they depended on judgment, anticipation, and the kind of spatial awareness that only develops through practice. Chen's solution was to place 2 students in a training mock-up of a B-17 waist section and have them track imaginary targets while calling out their movements to each other. The mock-up featured staggered positions matching actual B-17G configuration. Students who trained in this mock-up and then encountered older B-17F models with symmetrical positions immediately recognized the difference. The symmetrical positions feel wrong, one student reported after training in the mock-up and then being assigned to a B-17F for a training flight. Like someone designed it wrong and we're making do with a mistake. The staggered positions feel natural, like that's how it's supposed to be. This observation captured something significant about effective design. When done well, it feels inevitable and natural rather than clever or innovative. The student couldn't articulate exactly why staggered positions felt more natural than symmetrical ones. He just knew they worked better based on direct experience. Chen's training program became unofficial doctrine at Fort Myers, replicated by other instructors even though it wasn't part of the approved curriculum. When Army Air Forces Training Command inspectors visited Fort Myers in June 1944, they observed Chen's coordination training exercises and questioned whether they were necessary given that students would receive additional training at their operational units. Chen's squadron commander, Major Robert Hamilton, defended the program by pointing out that students who completed Chen's coordination training consistently received higher evaluations from their operational units after assignment. The inspectors accepted this justification and recommended that similar training be incorporated into the official curriculum at all flexible gunnery schools. By September 1944, coordination training in mock-up waist positions had become standard at all Army Air Forces gunnery schools. The modification had made the jump from combat experience to experimental program to standard production to training doctrine in less than 18 months. This represented remarkably rapid institutional learning, especially for a military organization that normally moved at bureaucratic pace. The speed of adoption reflected both the modification's obvious benefits and the desperate need for any improvement that could reduce bomber losses during the brutal air campaign over Germany. The European Air War reached its peak intensity during the winter of 1944 through 1945. The 8th Air Force was flying missions involving over 1,000 bombers nearly every day, weather permitted. German fighter opposition had declined from its 1943 peak due to pilot attrition and fuel shortages, but anti-aircraft artillery remained deadly accurate, and German fighters still posed significant threats when they managed to intercept formations. American losses continued, though at lower rates than the catastrophic period of autumn 1943. Every mission still meant some aircraft wouldn't return, some crews would die or be captured, some men would be wounded. Staff Sergeant Donald Hayes flew as a waist gunner with the 457th Bombardment Group from January through April 1945, completing 35 missions during the final months of the European War. Hayes kept a detailed journal throughout his combat tour, recording his observations and experiences with unusual literary skill for an enlisted man with only high school education. His journal provides rare insight into how waist gunners actually experienced combat and how they thought about their weapons and positions. "The gun is everything," Hayes wrote after his third mission. Not in some abstract way, not as a philosophical point about violence and warfare. I mean literally everything. Your life depends on whether this machine functions correctly when you need it, whether you can aim it accurately under stress. whether you can coordinate with Chen on the other side without getting in each other's way. The airplane could be flying perfectly, the pilot could be the best in the Air Force, the formation could be textbook perfect. But if my gun jams at the wrong moment, or if I miss my shot, or if Chen and I tangle up trying to engage the same fighter, we could die, just like that. The gun is everything. Hayes's journal entries track his growing confidence and competence over dozens of missions. Early entries describe fear, confusion, doubt about his abilities. Later entries show mastery of procedures, confidence in his judgment, comfortable coordination with Chen and the rest of his crew. One entry from March 19, 45, after his 28th mission, specifically mentions the waist gun positions. Today, I flew in a war-weary B-17F, that our regular aircraft was down for maintenance. This older bird had the old-style symmetrical waist positions, both guns directly across from each other instead of staggered like I'm used to. The difference was immediately obvious and incredibly frustrating. Chen and I kept interfering with each other during a fighter attack near the target. Not badly, nobody got hurt, but we definitely weren't as effective as we should have been. I asked the pilot why they don't modify all the older birds to have staggered positions, and he said it's not considered worth the effort since most F models are being phased out anyway. Maybe that's true from some accountant's perspective in Washington, but from where I stand, literally stand at this gun position, having those windows offset by a couple feet makes a real difference. I'll take our regular G model any day. Hayes survived his combat tour without serious injury, though his aircraft was heavily damaged twice by flak and once by fighter attack. He rotated home in May 1945, just as the war in Europe ended. His journal, donated to the Veterans History Project decades later, provides valuable documentation of how modifications like staggered waist guns affected the actual experience of combat from a crew member's perspective. Most official reports and analyses focused on aggregate statistics and system-level performance. Hayes' journal captured individual human experience, which was where modifications actually mattered. The transition from combat operations to peacetime demobilization after VE Day in May 1945 created enormous logistical challenges for the Army Air Forces. Thousands of B-17 seconds sat at bases across England and Europe, suddenly surplus to requirements. Many were flown back to the United States for demobilization or reassignment. Many more were scrapped on site, too worn out from combat operations to be worth ferrying home. The massive wartime production apparatus that had built thousands of bombers per year shut down almost overnight, as contracts were cancelled and production lines closed. Amid this chaos, the institutional knowledge embedded in aircraft modifications and crew training programs faced risk of being lost. Combat-experienced crews rotated home and demobilized, returning to civilian life and taking their hard-won knowledge with them. The urgent operational pressure that had driven rapid innovation and implementation of improvements disappeared as combat operations ended. The peacetime military that emerged from demobilization would be smaller, less experienced, and lacking the institutional memory of what had worked and what hadn't during the war. The Strategic Air Command, established in March 1946 as the post-war organization responsible for America's bomber force, faced the challenge of preserving lessons learned during World War II while adapting to new technologies and new strategic requirements. The B-17 and B-24 were already obsolete by 1946, replaced by larger, longer-range, higher-performance aircraft like the B-29 and the new B-36 under development. But the lessons learned from operating heavy bombers in combat remained relevant even as specific aircraft types changed. Colonel James Doolittle, who'd commanded the 8th Air Force during the critical period of 1944 through 1945, attempted to capture these lessons in a classified report titled Operational Analysis of Strategic Bombing Campaign, Equipment and Tactical Lessons Learned. The report, submitted to Army Air Forces headquarters in September 1946, ran to over 800 pages of detailed analysis, covering everything from formation tactics to bomb site accuracy to maintenance procedures. One section examined defensive armament modifications and their impact on bomber effectiveness. Doolittle's a report identified the staggered waist gun positions as one of approximately 30 modifications that had measurably improved bomber survivability and effectiveness during the war. The report praised the rapid implementation of the modification following the YB-40 trials and recommended that similar rapid testing and implementation procedures be maintained in peacetime for future modification programs. The bureaucratic inertia that characterizes peacetime procurement is a luxury we cannot afford in wartime, Doolittle wrote. Future conflicts will require equally rapid adaptation and innovation. The institutional mechanisms that enabled rapid implementation of improvements like staggered waist positions must be preserved and formalized. But preserving institutional mechanisms proved difficult as the military contracted and peacetime bureaucracy reasserted control. The informal networks, abbreviated procedures, and risk-tolerant decision-making that had characterized wartime innovation gave way to formal procurement processes, extensive testing requirements, and risk-averse management. This was probably inevitable and perhaps even necessary. The permissive environment of wartime experimentation had produced many successful innovations, but it had also wasted resources on failed experiments and occasionally produced modifications that caused more problems than they solved. Peacetime procurement aimed to prevent such waste through careful validation before implementation. The price of this caution was slower innovation. Modifications that might have been tested and implemented within months during wartime required years in peacetime. The balance between moving fast and moving carefully shifted decisively toward caution, and with that shift, something of the innovative spirit that had produced solutions like the staggered waist guns was lost, at least temporarily. It would take another war, Korea in 1950 through 53, to demonstrate again that combat drives innovation in ways peacetime operations cannot, and that institutional mechanisms for rapid testing and implementation of improvements remain essential capabilities that must be maintained even when not immediately needed. The last B-17 inches operational service with the United States Air Force was retired in 1959, ending a service life that had spanned nearly 2 decades. By then, the Flying Fortress was thoroughly obsolete, rendered irrelevant by jet aircraft, nuclear weapons, and guided missiles. The strategic bombing mission that B-17 seconds had pioneered was now carried out by aircraft like the B-52 Stratofortress, which could fly higher, faster, farther, and carry enormously more ordnance than the old propeller-driven bombers. But the lessons learned from B-17 operations, including subtle points about human factors in weapons system design, remained embedded in Air Force institutional knowledge. When Boeing designed the B-52 inches, the early 1950s, engineers paid careful attention to crew station ergonomics and workspace allocation. Gunners operating the aircraft's remote-controlled defensive turrets had adequate space to work, properly positioned displays and controls, and coordinated systems that prevented operators from interfering with each other. These design features didn't happen by accident. They reflected accumulated knowledge about human factors in aircraft design, knowledge that had been purchased expensively through the combat experience of thousands of World War II aircrews. The lineage from B-17 waist gunners colliding in cramped quarters to B-52 gunners working efficiently in well-designed crew stations couldn't be traced through any specific document or design decision. But the connection existed, embedded in engineering practice and institutional knowledge. The preservation of historical aircraft in museums ensures that future generations can see and experience the physical artifacts of past conflicts. But museums struggle to convey the operational context that made these artifacts significant. A B-17 on display in a climate-controlled hangar, carefully restored and beautifully maintained, bears little resemblance to the war-weary bomber limping home from a mission over Germany with wounded crew members, damaged engines, and hundreds of bullet holes in its aluminum skin. The staggered waist gun positions, visible on museum aircraft, tell no story to casual visitors. They appear as they are, windows offset by 42 inches longitudinally. Without explanation, without context, Without the testimony of men who actually fought from those positions, the modification means nothing. This is the challenge historians face in preserving and conveying the significance of incremental innovations. Dramatic breakthroughs make compelling narratives. The first jet engine, the first atomic bomb, the first radar system. These technologies changed warfare in obvious and measurable ways, but the accumulated impact of hundreds of small improvements often exceeded the impact of any single breakthrough. The B-17G that flew missions in 1945 was dramatically more capable and survivable than the B-17C that entered service in 1941, not because of any revolutionary breakthrough, but because of dozens of incremental improvements. Each improvement made the aircraft slightly better. Collectively, they made it survivable in the most hostile operational environment. The men who flew these missions, who benefited from these improvements, mostly didn't think about their historical significance. They thought about completing their assigned missions, protecting their crew members, and surviving to fly again tomorrow. If the staggered waist gun positions helped them accomplish these goals, that was enough. They didn't need to quantify the improvement in percentage terms or conduct statistical analysis of its effectiveness. They experienced it directly. The modification worked, it made their jobs easier. It probably saved some lives. That direct experience, shared across thousands of crew members, was the ultimate validation of the modification's value. As the World War II generation passes into history, taking their direct experience with them, we're left with documents, photographs, and preserved aircraft to tell their story. The challenge is to look at these artifacts and see not just the physical objects, but the human experiences they represent. The staggered waist gun positions on a B-17G aren't just asymmetrically positioned windows. They're evidence of an institutional learning process that identified a problem, developed a solution, tested it under combat conditions, and implemented it rapidly across an entire fleet. They represent the accumulated wisdom of men who fought for their lives in desperately dangerous conditions and learned through brutal experience what worked and what didn't. They embody the principle that good design serves human needs rather than expecting humans to adapt to poor design. The final mission of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign took place on April 25, 1945, targeting the Skoda armament works at Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Over 300 B-17 seconds participated in the raid, encountering light fighter opposition and moderate flak. All aircraft returned safely to their bases in England. The mission was anticlimactic compared to the brutal combat of earlier years, but it marked the symbolic end of a campaign that had transformed strategic warfare and cost the lives of 26,000 American airmen killed in action with the 8th Air Force alone. Among the aircraft flying that final mission were B-17Gs, featuring every modification that had been developed and implemented since the aircraft first entered combat 3 years earlier. Chin turrets, Cheyenne tail positions, improved oxygen systems, better armor protection, and yes, staggered waist gun positions. These aircraft represented the final evolution of the Flying Fortress design, incorporating all the lessons learned through bitter combat experience. They were as good as World War II-era bomber design could be, and they were already obsolete, soon to be replaced by jet-powered aircraft that would make them look slow and primitive. But the lessons they embodied, the knowledge purchased with the lives of the men who'd flown and died in earlier versions, that knowledge wasn't obsolete. It would be carried forward into new generations of aircraft, new contexts of warfare, new challenges requiring innovation and adaptation. The staggered waist gun positions on a B-17G, that small asymmetry that casual observers barely notice, stand as monument to this process of learning, adapting, and improving. They remind us that progress comes not just from breakthrough innovations, but from countless small improvements, each addressing specific problems identified through experience. And they honor the men who flew these aircraft into harm's way, who provided the feedback that drove improvement, who survived or didn't survive, based partly on whether designers and commanders listened to their experience and adapted systems accordingly. These lessons, purchased expensively through the combat experience of thousands of men over hostile territory, remain relevant today in every context where human performance and survival depend on the tools and systems we design. The staggered waist gun positions on a B-17 aren't just a footnote in aviation history. They're a reminder of principles that every generation must learn, remember, and apply to new challenges.